before the world came to know the terrifying cackle that echoed across New York's skies, before the pumpkin bombs ignited chaos and the gliders sliced through the night, there was only a man whose genius and ambition would both define and destroy him. His name was Norman Osborn. Born into a world that demanded power, Norman was the son of Amberson Osborn, a failed inventor and bitter man who instilled in young Norman a ruthless philosophy: only the strong survive. Unlike other children, Norman did not grow up surrounded by affection or warmth. His childhood was one of shadows, where failure was a crime and weakness was unforgivable. From his father, he inherited a singular obsession to never be powerless again. This obsession fueled his every step. Norman's brilliance shone early. Gifted with an extraordinary mind, he mastered the sciences, excelling in chemistry, physics, and engineering. But knowledge alone was not enough. To Norman, science was a weapon, a means to control, to dominate, to ensure that no one could ever dictate his fate. With his formidable intellect and his merciless will, he built Oscorp, the empire that would become the cornerstone of his legacy. Oscorp was more than a company. It was Norman's throne. It gave him wealth, influence, and the ability to shape the future. To the world, he was a visionary industrialist. To his employees, he was a tyrant cloaked in respectability. And to his son, Harry Osborn, he was a distant figure, a father who demanded perfection but offered little love. Norman justified his cruelty as preparation, a way of forging Harry into something stronger. But behind the mask of the successful businessman, there was always the lurking fear of irrelevance, the terror that he could lose everything he had built. That fear drove him to his greatest and most terrible experiment. While developing a performance-enhancing serum, a formula meant to create the perfect soldier, Norman made a fateful decision. He would test it on himself. For Norman, it was not merely science, it was destiny. The serum promised strength, resilience, and intelligence beyond human limits. It promised the power he had always craved, but destiny often comes at a cost. The formula transformed him, body and mind. His strength multiplied, his reflexes sharpened, his intellect became more dangerous than ever before. Yet alongside these gifts came something darker: instability, rage, a voice that whispered from the corners of his mind. The serum had unleashed not just his potential, but his demons. Norman Osborn was no longer just a man. He had become something else, something monstrous. He became the Green Goblin. The Goblin was not simply a mask or a weapon. He was the embodiment of Norman's deepest desires and darkest fears. Armed with advanced technology, a terrifying glider, and weapons of his own twisted design, pumpkin bombs, razor bats, and more, the Goblin emerged as a figure of chaos. His laugh carried over the city as a promise. No one was safe. Not the innocent, not the powerful, not even the heroes who dared to oppose him. But to understand the Goblin, one must understand the tragedy of Norman Osborn. He was not a simple villain, nor a monster born in the shadows. He was a man who reached for greatness and was consumed by it. The Goblin was his creation, but also his reflection, the mirror image of his ambition without restraint. And soon, his path would collide with a hero destined to define him. A young man, hidden behind a mask of his own, a man who represented everything Norman despised, and yet everything he secretly longed for. Their confrontation would ignite one of the greatest rivalries in the history of Marvel. For when Norman Osborn became the Green Goblin, the world gained not just a villain, it gained a legend. When Norman Osborn first donned the mask of the Green Goblin, he believed he was simply wearing armor. He believed the cowl, the cape, the glider, all of it, was just another suit, like a knight preparing for war. But the truth was far darker. Norman wasn't wearing the Goblin. The Goblin was wearing him. The serum that coursed through his veins had done more than enhance his strength and sharpen his reflexes. It had carved into his mind like fire on parchment, burning away restraint, caution, and empathy. What was left was something feral, unbound, and hungry. The Goblin wasn't just an identity, it was an infestation, a demon given form, with Norman's genius fueling its malice. For weeks, Norman wrestled with himself. In one moment, he was the brilliant industrialist, father to Harry Osborn, titan of Oscorp's empire. In the next, he was the Goblin laughing into the night sky, hurling pumpkin bombs at anyone who dared stand in his way. The line between Norman and the Goblin blurred until it ceased to exist. The first true eruption of this madness came when the Goblin set his sights on Spider-Man. not simply as an adversary, but as an obsession. Spider-Man represented everything Norman couldn't control: youthful defiance, unshakable morality, and power uncorrupted by greed. To defeat Spider-Man, the Goblin wasn't satisfied with brute force. He needed to break him, to twist his world until even the web-slinger questioned the value of his cause. And so began the Reign of Terror. Explosions in the streets of New York, Oscorp technology weaponized for destruction, waves of chaos designed not for conquest, but for spectacle. The Goblin wanted the world to see his laughter echoing above the flames, to feel powerless under his reign of madness. Yet beneath the chaos, Norman Osborn still lingered, faintly, like a ghost trapped inside a storm. He still saw his son Harry, desperate for his father's approval, confused by his absence and erratic behavior. Norman wanted to protect him, to guide him, but the Goblin saw Harry as weakness, a loose thread in the fabric of dominance. And so the war within Norman raged, as the man fought to keep what little humanity he still possessed, while the Goblin whispered that family, friends, and loyalty were nothing but shackles to be broken. It was this duality, this fragile fracture between man and monster that made the Goblin so terrifying. Unlike other villains who wore their cruelty openly, Norman was a man who could shake your hand in the boardroom by day and send you screaming into the abyss by night. Oscorp's skyscrapers were monuments to his genius, while the Goblin's rampages were monuments to his madness. Two worlds colliding, with Norman's soul caught in the middle. The battles with Spider-Man escalated, each encounter more brutal, more personal. The Goblin studied him, not just his powers, but his heart. He discovered that Spider-Man's strength lay not in his webs or agility, but in the people he loved. Aunt May, Mary Jane, Gwen Stacy, names that the Goblin turned into targets on his twisted chessboard. If he could not shatter Spider-Man with fists or fire, he would do so with heartbreak. And when tragedy finally struck, it was not just Spider-Man who was broken. Norman Osborn was too. For in the moment of Gwen Stacy's death, the Goblin had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Spider-Man's rage, the public's fear, his own son's resentment, these became the chains that even Norman's fractured mind could feel tightening around him. Yet, even in defeat, the Goblin laughed, for what he had unleashed upon the world could not be undone. Norman Osborn, the man, may have faltered, but the Green Goblin had become eternal, a demon unbound, lingering in shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to rise again. The city would never be free of him. Spider-Man would never forget him, and Norman himself would never truly escape him, because the Green Goblin was not just a villain. He was the dark reflection of ambition without limits, genius without morality, and power without restraint. He was the nightmare behind the mask, and he would forever be hungry. The moment Norman Osborn put on the mask, there was no turning back. He was no longer just a man burdened by ambition. He was the embodiment of unchecked chaos. As the Green Goblin, Norman tore through New York City with fire, fury, and a twisted sense of joy. For every skyscraper that trembled, for every innocent that screamed, for every hero that stood in his way, the Goblin left his mark, a scar etched onto the very soul of the Marvel Universe. What had begun as a desperate grasp for control transformed into a reign of terror, no longer driven solely by corporate greed or scientific curiosity. Osborn, under the Goblin's influence, sought something more primal: domination. His Goblin persona was not simply a mask, it was the reflection of his fractured psyche, a monster demanding to be unleashed. From the shadows of Oscorp's laboratories, Osborn built an arsenal of destruction. His infamous pumpkin bombs became fiery symbols of his lunacy, each explosion echoing his maniacal laughter across the night sky. His glider, sleek, deadly, and relentless, turned him into a predator of the skies, a nightmare swooping down upon the city without warning. And with each strike, he grew bolder, more unhinged, until New York no longer saw him as just another villain. He was something far worse. He was a legend of fear, but his greatest obsession remained the same. Spider-Man. To Norman Osborn, Peter Parker was more than a nuisance. He was a mirror. Spider-Man represented everything Osborn was not: hope, responsibility, the ability to rise above power rather than be consumed by it. This drove Norman deeper into his madness, for he could not reconcile the idea that a boy, barely out of adolescence, could outwit, outfight, and outshine him. Their battles became urban warfare, across rooftops, through city streets, in flames, and shattered glass, Goblin and Spider-Man clashed with a ferocity that shook New York to its core. The Goblin tested Peter's limits like no other, targeting not just the hero, but the man behind the mask. He discovered Spider-Man's greatest vulnerability, his heart, and with that revelation came the most infamous act of Norman Osborn's reign of madness, the death of Gwen Stacy. On that bridge, high above the waters, the Goblin didn't just attack Spider-Man physically, he broke him. With one cruel act, he left an eternal wound on Peter Parker's soul, a wound that would never truly heal. That moment, more than any battle, defined Osborn's legacy. He wasn't just a villain, he was a destroyer of lives, a dealer of grief, a reminder that even the strongest heroes can be shattered. But madness has a cost. For all his victories, Norman could not escape the crumbling foundation of his own mind. The Goblin persona clawed deeper into his consciousness, blurring the line between Norman Osborn, corporate titan, and the Green Goblin, agent of chaos. At times, he would try to deny it, to bury the Goblin deep inside, to cling to some shred of normality. But like a whisper in the dark, the Goblin always returned, louder and louder, until he was the only voice left. The world saw him as a terrorist, a lunatic with weapons of mass terror. But Norman saw himself as something far grander. In his mind, he was not merely a man or a monster. He was evolution itself, the next stage of human ambition, unbound by morality. He believed that through fear, through violence, through absolute dominance, he could shape the world in his image. And if that meant burning everything down, so be it. The reign of madness was not just about destruction. It was about Osborn's desperate need for immortality. He wanted to be remembered not as a businessman or even a criminal, but as a force of nature. Someone who could not be ignored. Someone whose shadow would linger over history. Yet beneath all the rage, the violence, and the terror, there remained a flicker of truth, a broken man who had lost himself to the monster he created. The Goblin was not just Norman's weapon, he was Norman's curse, and the deeper he fell, the harder it became to know whether Osborn wore the mask, or whether the mask had always been wearing him. As his battles escalated, Norman Osborn's name became synonymous with terror. Politicians, corporations, and even other villains both feared and respected him. He was not merely a threat to Spider-Man anymore, he was a threat to the world. The Goblin had evolved beyond New York's skyline. His madness was spreading, and soon, no one would be safe. This was no longer about one man's descent into chaos. It was about the rise of an icon of evil. And the world would soon learn that the Green Goblin was not finished. He was only just beginning. The Green Goblin is more than Norman Osborn. He is a curse, a disease of greed, paranoia, and ambition that refuses to die. What began as one man's descent into madness has spread like wildfire through generations, infecting others who would take up the mantle, willingly or not. The Goblin became a symbol of corruption, a living reminder that power always comes with a price, and that some prices are paid in blood. After Norman's many deaths and resurrections, the shadow of the Goblin never left New York. His son, Harry Osborn, once victim, once ally, and always torn between love for Peter Parker and hatred for Spider-Man, eventually gave in to the same darkness. For years, Harry fought his destiny, trying to escape the shadow of his father's sins. But the Goblin serum, and the twisted legacy that came with it, would not let him go. Harry became the second Green Goblin, proving that the madness was hereditary, passed down not only through blood but through obsession. Harry's path was tragic, defined by a desperate attempt to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy, while also resenting the very man who had cursed him. In his hands, the Goblin mask became more than a symbol of power. It became a shackle, a reminder that no matter how hard he tried, he could not escape the Osborn name. His story ended in sacrifice, a final act of redemption as he gave his life to save Spider-Man. But even in death, the cycle was not broken. Others would rise. Phil Urich, once a young and misguided hero, took the mantle of the Goblin and twisted it into something far darker. He was not a scientist, not a mastermind, but his reckless hunger for chaos made him just as dangerous. The Goblin's arsenal, the glider, the pumpkin bombs, the madness found new hands, proving that the role had become bigger than Norman himself. The Green Goblin had become a myth, an identity that anyone willing to abandon their soul could wear. Meanwhile, Norman's own story was far from over. Again and again, he returned from death, each time more unstable, more ambitious, more certain that he was destined to rule. His war with Spider-Man became eternal, a battle not just of fists and bombs but of ideology. To Norman, the Goblin is freedom, freedom from morality, from weakness, from the chains of humanity. To Spider-Man, it is corruption, the very embodiment of everything he must resist. Their conflict is not just personal, it is cosmic. Two men locked in an endless dance of heroism and villainy, one defined by responsibility, the other by unquenchable greed. Norman's ambition eventually reached far beyond the streets of New York. He became the Iron Patriot, leader of Hammer, and for a time, the most powerful man in America. Dressed not as the Goblin, but as a twisted symbol of patriotism, Norman showed the world his greatest weapon, manipulation. Yet even with the world under his control, the Goblin was never far away. Madness always lurked beneath the surface, clawing its way back. It was inevitable. It was destiny. The Green Goblin cannot be destroyed. He is not just a man, nor a mask, nor a serum. He is an idea. The idea that power can corrupt even the brightest mind, that fear can turn genius into tyranny, that the line between sanity and madness is thinner than a razor's edge. Norman Osborn may die, Harry may fall, others may rise, but the Goblin always returns, always. And so the legacy continues. Every time Spider-Man swings across the city, he knows that truth, somewhere hidden in the shadows, the Goblin is waiting. Whether it is Norman, Harry, or another soul seduced by chaos, the pumpkin bombs will fall again. The glider will scream through the sky, and the maniacal laughter of the Green Goblin will echo across the night, because the Green Goblin is eternal. He is madness given form. He is the shadow that will never leave Spider-Man's soul, and as long as there is a Spider-Man, there will always be a Green Goblin.